Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 13 of the Pet Behavior Chat. So, this is going to be the first episode of a few episodes where we actually delve into aggressive behaviors, bites in both dogs and cats. And I want to, in this episode today in particular, give you a few practical tips on what are going to be the first things that you're going to do if an aggressive event has happened. So either your dog or your cat, if either of those have either bitten you or perhaps a family member or a visitor or an unknown person, what are the immediate strategies that you can implement right now in order to make sure that everybody stays safe as you take stock and as you perhaps get in touch with a professional to try and help manage this situation. So what I'm not going to go into in a massive amount of detail here are the reasons why perhaps your dog or your cat has shown aggression. There are so many different reasons, and a little bit outside of the scope of this episode, not to say that we won't do that in a future episode. But also a lot of times this is really, what an individual behavior consultation is for, to try and understand the whys, the motivations, what could be at the cause of this, what could be driving this behavior, what's the dog's or the cat's emotional state, what's going on here. Is there maybe a medical contribution? So lots and lots to unpick there, but that's not what I want to talk about today. What I really want to talk about today are the safety management and behavioral first aid aspects of this. And this is often what we will tell our clients in the first instance. Let's say we have somebody who gets in touch with us because they're maybe a little bit upset or panicked because their pet has bitten someone or there's been an aggressive event, and they reach out to us. And of course, they would love to have a consultation straight away, or they immediately want to know what to do. And sometimes we don't have consultations available that day, that week. And so we initially provide them with some safety management strategies, some behavioral first aid to put into place before they then come and see us. And we actually start to unravel what's gone on and start to think about putting a treatment plan in place. So I'm going to talk about both dogs and cats, but I'm going to talk about them separately because they do present slightly separately. However, safety management is safety management and applies everywhere. And especially important if you have vulnerable people in your home, in your family, if you have perhaps young children in your family, or if you have elderly parents or family members living with you that have perhaps quite sort of thin skin, or where an aggressive event could really physically put them in harm's way. With children, that's self-explanatory. With elderly people, a dog being aggressive could easily knock them over. And again, they perhaps have underlying medical conditions that a bite might be really serious for. Let's say if they're immunocompromised, for example, or if they bruise very easily and they have thin skin. So it's really important to consider who's in your home if the aggressive event has happened in the home. Obviously, we also want to consider people coming into the home, and we also want to consider people and or dogs outside of the home, and of course also other animals living in our home. So when I say anybody living in our home, I mean people and other animals, and obviously also people that we might encounter outside. So it's really important that we think about the safety aspects of that. And in some countries, certainly us here living in the UAE, we need to be very careful that our pet's behavior doesn't cause injury, harm, hurt, because that might have implications, whether that's legal or, I know I have one client who doesn't live in the UAE, but lives in a different country, where her pet's aggressive behavior meant that she wasn't allowed to walk the pet in the community unmuzzled anymore. So they have implications, right? And these are the types of safety things that we want to talk about. I also just want to mention here that as pet owners, that safety management piece is absolutely our responsibility. It is our responsibility to make sure that we protect both others, but also our pet in that moment. So when we do have aggressive behaviors, we really need to start to think about the responsibility that we have in terms of keeping things safe. And that's really where these safety management measures and strategies can come in very helpful. So I'm going to talk about dogs first. And with dogs, we have a number of different things that we can use to help manage safety. So we're talking a lot about barriers, things that can prevent bites, physical barriers, physical, I guess, kind of limits or boundaries that can help to keep everybody else in the home safe, but also keep our dogs safe, our pets safe in that moment, our dogs safe in that moment. So we're thinking about things like baby gates. We're thinking about things like closed doors. Obviously, we need to consider what the dog feels like behind that baby gate and behind that closed door. That's important to consider as well. But I just want to quickly list for you all the things that we can consider. Being tethered on a long leash could be a safety management piece. A crate, as long as the dog feels comfortable in that crate. Supervision can be classed as a safety management tool, right? So, for example, we would never want to leave dogs and children, or babies in particular, unsupervised in any circumstance, really. So, physical barriers, leashes, crates, supervision. And then we also need to talk about muzzles, because muzzles are a really valuable and important safety management tool. And I just want to stop and pause and just chat about muzzles a little bit here. So I think muzzles in the past have gotten a very bad reputation, and muzzles in the past also have looked very kind of ugly, right? They've been these black, huge kind of cage type things, or, even worse, like leather muzzles, or things that kind of go onto the dog's head and make them look quite menacing and scary. And I know that many people don't like the idea of putting a muzzle on their dog, because they feel that it makes the dog look scary or bad or mean, when actually they're not at all a bad or mean dog. And I guess there's been a bit of a stigma around that, right? We're used to seeing these sort of large breed dogs with muzzles on that are being very tightly controlled. We're used to our dog perhaps having to wear a muzzle in the veterinary clinic, and putting that muzzle on is a huge ordeal and not at all what it should be about. So muzzles often leave a bit of a bitter taste and are quite uncomfortable for some people to talk about. But in fact, we need to start to shift our way of thinking about muzzles, and we need to start thinking of them as a really valuable tool for both ourselves and our dogs in many cases. So essentially, we want to start viewing our muzzles as just another piece of kit. Just as we would have our harnesses, or our leads, or our food bowls, or our clicker, or whatever else it might be that we have as sort of pieces of equipment on a daily basis with our dogs, muzzles absolutely can be part of that. They are really good safety management tools in instances where you might need them. And for many dogs, that could be the case. But also they afford the dogs themselves a bit of protection. Imagine if you're walking your dog outside and you don't want all the children to come running over to your dog to try and pet them, and your dog might find that really uncomfortable, and they might growl or maybe snap defensively because they don't want to be approached or touched, or they don't like children running at them at high speed. Then wearing a muzzle, and happily wearing a muzzle, that's an important thing, could be a really nice kind of automatic distance increasing tool, that perhaps the kids, if they see your dog wearing a muzzle, won't come running over to them. Or people might just give you that little bit of extra space if your dog's wearing a muzzle. And that can really work in your dog's favor, because space is a really important piece and element for many, many dogs who do react defensively. So Yeah, I really want us to start thinking differently about muzzles. And you'll hear in the outro, but I'm also going to mention at the end of this podcast, we've got an amazing free resource for you, which is a brilliant, brilliant video that's been done by Ilse that teaches you how to correctly fit a muzzle for your dog. Because when we start to think about teaching our dogs to comfortably wear a muzzle, the very first piece that we need to consider is actually finding a muzzle that they feel comfortable in. So we absolutely don't want to use these kind of fabric mesh type muzzles that really close our dogs' noses very tightly, or the leather muzzles that do the same. But instead, we want to use a basket muzzle or a cage muzzle that allows our dogs room to move their jaws. It allows them to be able to open their mouths to pant. They can still receive treats through the muzzle. They can still drink water through the muzzle. So getting the right muzzle is such an important piece. And we really want to gift you this free resource, which I'll definitely put a link to in the show notes. I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the podcast, so that you can actually understand what is the right muzzle and how do you get the muzzle that's fitting correctly. Because there's also, no point getting a muzzle and then it pokes your dog in the eye, or it's too tight, or it just doesn't fit properly, or it comes off, which then defeats the object of it actually being a safety management tool. So muzzles is a big topic, and we're going to talk a little bit more about muzzles as we kind of go through these episodes. But coming back to the safety management pieces. So I've already mentioned a number for you: baby gates, closed doors, tethered on long leashes, crates, muzzles, supervision. Those are kind of the classic ones that I would say. Harnesses themselves can sometimes be a good safety management tool. So having a harness that's comfortable, that you can perhaps attach a long leash to or a tether to. So those are the ones that are kind of generally used and that are relatively easy to use in the home. Now, one thing that I always talk about is something called 2 layers of safety. Because as we know, life happens. If the dog's behind the closed door, maybe somebody walks in, doesn't know the dog's in there, opens the door, dog shoots out, and then we have a management fail and potentially an aggressive event ensuing. So we always want to think about 2 layers of safety so that we can try and prevent a management fail from happening. So what could that look like? Well, that could look like your dog being muzzled and being behind a closed door, or being muzzled and being behind a baby gate. Or it could be that they're under supervision and tethered by a leash at the same time. Or it could be that they're in their crate and there's perhaps another physical barrier, maybe a baby gate or a closed door, something like that. So you understand what I mean by having these 2 layers. It means that if one layer fails, then we've always got the second layer to back it up. Now, you might be thinking that this all sounds quite extreme and, maybe your situation isn't that bad. But what we need to understand is that every time that your dog has an aggressive event, reacts aggressively, it's going to increase the chances that they might show that behavior again, because their brain chemistry gets wired in a way or gets influenced in a way that it's going to make it more and more likely for them to have future aggressive events. So safety management is absolutely a tool to prevent people or other animals from getting bitten, but it's also a way of actually preventing the dog that's acting aggressively, preventing their behavioral neurobiochemistry from deteriorating further. So we always have to make sure that we think about the benefits to both everybody else in the home, but also the benefits to the patient themselves. So that safety management piece is really, really important. So I've obviously been talking a little bit about kind of dog to human, but the same goes for inter-dog aggression cases at home. So where you have, perhaps 2 dogs or maybe even more than 2 dogs that can get involved in arguments and fights with each other, it's also really important to stop that from happening and to protect each dog or each of the dogs involved in that from being involved in further aggressive events. And again, we're talking about physical barriers, physical boundaries. We're talking about making sure that they don't get physical access to each other, whatever that might look like in your home. And again, this is where behavior consultations come in, because we then look at your individual situation and we tailor things to you, and we try and come up with creative ideas where safety management options might work for your particular family, for your particular home, for your home layout, for how your dog feels about being in certain situations, i.e. behind a baby gate or in a crate or behind a closed door and so on. So each of those safety management strategies might not work for each patient. So I'm just giving you a number of different suggestions for what you might be able to use. And crate training comes in here as well, right? So we know that some dogs absolutely love their crates and see them as their safe havens, and that's fantastic if that is so. And other dogs might really be fearful of the crate, or might have confinement related distress, might not like being in confined spaces. And if that's the case, then either the crate isn't going to be a suitable safety management tool for us, or we can, at the same time as we embark on muzzle training, we can also embark on crate training, so that we have more and more options for safety management as we go along our journey. So that's a little bit about safety management for dogs. Now I'm going to talk about safety management for cats a bit. Now, in cats, we do have human-directed aggressive behaviors in some cats. What I see much more commonly, especially here in the UAE, however, is inter-cat aggression. So 2 or more cats in the same household fighting with each other. And these fights can get really quite serious, to the point where we can get physical injury, or where the mental and emotional toll that fight takes on the cats is really quite extreme, to the point where, perhaps what we call the victim cat doesn't want to come out of their hiding places anymore. Sometimes it can get so bad that they urinate or defecate if they're involved in a fight. So again, we really want to make sure that we have safety management strategies in place. Now, obviously, if your cat is acting aggressively towards people, that can be a little bit more challenging, because physical barriers don't necessarily mean quite as much to cats, or aren't as easy perhaps to accomplish in the home for cats as they are for dogs. But still, we want to make sure that we can try and understand what are the triggers, what are the most likely times that the cat might respond aggressively, what's the context. And when we start to understand that, then we can start to avoid those contexts. Some other really good practical solutions for human-directed aggressive behaviors in cats can be to just distract the cat away from yourself. So having always somewhere close by either some treats that you can throw away from yourself, or a toy that you can kind of put, direct those on unwanted aggressive behaviors, which sometimes might be inappropriate play behaviors. Try and direct them away from our physical person onto a toy or onto something else. Another really important thing with cats is petting related aggression. So some cats can become quite frustrated and can become aggressive if they're either being touched, held, stroked, cuddled for too long, or on a part of their body that they don't like, or in a way that they don't like. And I always say about cats, cats oftentimes, they really enjoy our company. They like being near to us, close to us, in the same room as us, maybe even on the sofa with us, or maybe even on our laps. But they don't necessarily want to be touched, or they don't want to be touched for a long time, or they don't want to be touched on certain areas of their body, especially their bellies or their legs maybe. And those are times where then the cat that has been, happily and quietly lying on your lap, all of a sudden has just had too much, and they either use their claws or their teeth to kind of express their frustration and to try and stop that physical interaction. And that's something I see quite commonly, right? That's a pretty classic presentation in cats, is that petting related aggression that can come from just being interacted with by a person that they don't like. So that's a little bit about human-directed aggressive behaviors and safety management there. I have seen a couple of extreme cases in cats where the cats have been quite unpredictable in their aggression towards people, and the aggression and the injuries have been quite extreme. Those are rare cases, and they're quite extreme cases, and usually in those cases, we have something pathological going on. It could be that there's a neurological issue. It could be that there's extreme pain. It could be that there's, some kind of an abnormal behavior that's going on that is pathological. And those cases, unfortunately, in my experience, are difficult to treat. So we always then also look at what's the intensity, what's the severity, what's the duration, what's the frequency, how often is it happening, how bad are the bites, how safe is it for people to be living with this cat. So, but as I say, they're rare cases, and in those cases, we might need to go to more extreme safety management measures, which is really the cat being separated until we can try and understand what's going on there. So that's a little bit about safety management for cats in cat-human aggression. So I just want to talk also about cat-cat aggression, or inter-cat aggression, as we call it. And this, as I said, is a much, much more common presentation that certainly I see here in the UAE. And I'm actually going to be devoting one episode, which is episode 15, purely to that, to inter-cat aggression, because it's a presentation I have quite a bit of experience with, and it's something I see a lot here in the UAE. And yeah, they can be quite extreme cases. And again, safety management here is really important. So oftentimes we'll have a scenario where we have a cat that tends to be more the aggressor, and then we have a cat that tends to be more the victim cat. And we need to think about strict separation here, especially if the events are frequent. If it's the case that the aggressor cat, as soon as he sees or maybe even just smells the other cat, they get highly aroused and they stare and they stalk and they chase and they pounce and they corner and all those things, then we need to separate those cats. And that can oftentimes looks more like giving the victim cat their own safe space. So perhaps then creating a room for the victim cat where they've got everything that they need and they can just be in that room and just have some respite and some safety from this aggressor cat. And in my experience, those victim cats that can often be very scared, very anxious, hide away, they stop eating, they stop grooming. Sometimes they just stay in their hidey hole to try and avoid any kind of, interaction or altercation with that aggressor cat. They can become quite mentally and emotionally unwell. And oftentimes, as soon as you give them their own safe space, they actually start to turn a corner quite quickly, and they start to kind of come out of that extreme state of fear and anxiety, and they start to be able to behave a little bit more normally again. So in those inter-cat aggression cases, it's really important that we do safety management for the sake of both cats, because again, even the aggressor cat is feeling something in that moment. And for them, it's usually frustration. It's often to do with territory, resources, the fact that they're unable to kind of expel this intruder cat from their space. And yes, even though they live in the same household and they belong to the same family, they can still view each other as intruders if they're not socially bonded. And again, I'll talk a lot more about this in episode 15, but it's really important to do that safety management piece in those cases. And to be honest with you, many cat owners already do this without us having them to tell them to do that. So oftentimes when I get called into one of these cases, it'll have been the case that the cats have already been separated for a number of weeks, and now they're looking for help for the next step. Is it even possible to reintroduce them to each other? What would that look like? And what do we need to do to potentially make that a successful outcome? But yeah, so safety management is very, very important. And oftentimes that permanent separation lasts for probably longer than people would like it to. And again, it's difficult because management fails are possible. One cat might be able to open the door, or if somebody enters the room of the other cat, the victim cat, let's say the aggressor zooms in, and all of a sudden we've got the two cats in the same space, and and something bad happens. So And that's where I also then advise people about that 2 layers of safety, if it's possible. So having maybe a door and a baby gate there for the cats, even though they can probably jump over the baby gate, but just having that additional physical barrier. Or we've come up with all kinds of constructions where we've had sort of, 2 physical barriers between cats, so that the likelihood of a management fail is less and less. Obviously, we don't have tools such as muzzles for cats. I would never, ever recommend a muzzle for a cat. It's also quite difficult to crate a cat. They oftentimes, that space is just not enough for them. They need all their resources in their environment. So we don't have perhaps as many tools in terms of safety management for cats. But we do need to consider absolutely safety management, and in some cases also those 2 layers of safety. All right, so that's a little bit about safety management. I want to just touch on behavioral first aid, because this is also something that we might recommend quite quickly, perhaps before we go to a behavior consultation. So if we have cats that have been involved in an aggressive event, and if we've got high arousal and, everything is just kind of heightened, and, everybody's quite stressed and we've got emotions running high, then we'll often perhaps recommend a course of a short-acting medication. That can be something like gabapentin, or for dogs and cats, gabapentin works for both of those, or maybe gabapentin and or trazodone, maybe another medication such as clonidine. We want something that's fast-acting and that can just help to reduce anxiety and high arousal in that moment. But that's, again, where, the guidance of a veterinary behavior expert or a veterinary behaviorist or a vet interested in behavior needs to come in, because obviously it's only us that can prescribe those medications, and you need to have a pretty good understanding of those medications to try and understand what might work. But I always feel it's quite important that we don't just let our patients and our clients, our families, suffer in silence in these situations. Because just like physical first aid, if you had a dog walk through the door with a trauma, or with a physical injury, a physical trauma, you would absolutely treat them and, for sure provide first aid in that moment. And exactly the same goes for mental and emotional trauma as well. So if we've had a dog or a cat that's been involved in an aggressive event, or that's been in an incident, it's going to have left some kind of mental and emotional mark on them. And there are absolutely things that we can do as a behavioral first aid tools to help with that. And oftentimes I've done many behavior first aid consultations, which are much shorter consults, usually done virtually, maybe 30 minutes or 45 minutes before we're able to give that client a full behavior consultation, which are obviously much longer. If possible, I'd prefer to see the animals in person, but not necessarily. Offering those behavior first aid consults has been really important for everyone's safety, and also just for relieving stress in both the animals and the clients in that moment. So behavioral first aid is something that I feel is very important. I don't think we talk about it enough. And there are things that can be done quite quickly, whether they're making changes to the environment, setting up those safety management strategies, separating animals, or providing some fast acting medication that can help in those situations. It's really important that we think about behavioral first aid like that. Okay, so those are my thoughts on safety management in dogs and cats, and on behavioral first aid in situations like this in both dogs and cats. And then before we sign off for today, I just want to reiterate our free resource, which is a muzzle fitting video. It's about 10 minutes in length, and Ilse talks so beautifully about how to choose the correct muzzle for your dog, what you need to think about in terms of fitting it. She actually goes through how to measure your dog's nose in order to try and understand which muzzle is going to be the right one for your dog. So that's absolutely free, and you can get access to that by clicking the link that we put down in the show notes, and we're also going to have that link up on our social media channels. And then if you would like to delve further into muzzle training, we also have a course, which we'll also provide the link to, which is available on our website, which is trinityvetbehavior.com. Behavior spelt IOU, but I'll put the link down in the show notes. We actually have a 3-part muzzle fitting course, which you could also have a look at if you would like to, not muzzle fitting, muzzle training course, sorry, a 3-part muzzle training course that you could also have a look at if you would like to learn how to muzzle train your dog. And again, Ilse runs this course, and it's so beautifully done in that we want to make absolutely sure that our dogs actually enjoy wearing the muzzle. So we always almost turn it into a game where they kind of dress themselves with a muzzle. They pop their little noses into the muzzle and they start to learn that wearing a muzzle is a really great thing. They get lots of reinforcement whilst they're wearing the muzzle, because what we don't want is to get forced into a situation where something bad happens and then we have to shove a muzzle on our dog. And that rarely works out well for anyone. If you're either a vet or a vet nurse, or if you've ever encountered that in the veterinary clinic when you've taken your dog to the vet, it's never a nice experience for anyone, really. So training them to happily wear a muzzle, to almost kind of, put the muzzle on themselves, that's almost the end goal that we want, is a really, really valuable thing. So that is our muzzle training course, which is 3 parts. They're 3 sort of shortish videos, but they will give you all the tools to need to start training your dog to happily wear a muzzle. And then, of course, our completely free of charge muzzle fitting video, which you can get and have a look at, and that will hopefully set you up in the right direction of getting a muzzle that fits your dog well, so that you can then go on to train them to wear it happily. Okay, so that's everything for this episode. Please let me know if you've got any questions. It's a big topic, I realize that, and it's really difficult in one podcast episode to kind of delve deep into aggressive behaviors. We'll be unraveling things a little bit more. I've got some great guests coming on. We're actually going to speak to one of my clients who went through a journey with their dog. And I'm also going to be talking about intercat aggression in particular in episode 15. So lots and lots more on aggressive incidents, aggressive behavior, aggressive events. And yeah, that's everything for today. So I hope you've enjoyed safety management and behavioral first aid as it relates to aggressive events. And yeah, let us know if you've got any questions, and I'm going to see you in the next episode. All right, bye for now.